Good evening. Today we're learning Maseches Nazir Daf Lamed Hey, and we're starting 7 lines or so from the bottom of Lamed Daled Amud Beis, in the middle of the line at Omar Mar. Let's do Chazara, just a quick Chazara, not a long Chazara. We saw that there's a machlokes in our Mishnah as to whether or not, actually in the Brisa, as to whether or not the leaves and the shoots of grapes are included in the Isser of Nazir, or if they are not included in the Isser of Nazir. And we saw that there was a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon. And yesterday we explained that Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion that the way he viewed this pasuk was in the lens of ribui and miut. Masha'en came the Rabbanon were looking at this pasuk through the lens of klale uprate. And we spoke about this yesterday. We're going to extend the conversation into today. When I was learning this, I took notes. It's very hard to hold cup with every distinction, so I wrote them down. It makes it much easier to write things down in these kinds of sugyas. Now, when we were analyzing the sheet of the Rabbanan yesterday, which is the case was actually a case of prat uklal uprat. It's very hard for me to say that because I'm used to the other one, which we're going to learn about later. But which is not one of the Yud Gimel, which is itself interesting because there's a lot of things that are left out. Rabbi Shmuel was had his own. There's no ribuy miut either, which is okay. So yesterday we had learned the following line, which we're repeating. Then the first 5 lines that we're going to be learning now are a repeat. We had said yesterday that in regards to the pradu klalu prat, that Omar Mar, we had said imaha prat mufurash pri gomor. Maybe we would have thought that the pasuk was speaking about a full pri. Af kol pri gomor, says the Gemara, that couldn't have been what the prat uklal uprat was talking about, because Amris, if you were to have said that, im kain mahi niach hakasu b'mashmo shelo omro, then what would have been left out of the pasuk? If the Torah had told us in regards to the klal uprat, in regards to the prat uklal uprat, that the type of fruit we're talking about is a perfectly complete fruit, namely the full grape. So then we know what's included. The grape is included, everything else is left out. And therefore that's impossible because anovim velachim yiveshim aksivi, we would have known the din of anovim and lachim yiveshim, anovim lachim v'yiveshim, and we also would have known yain v'chometz aksivi. We would have known all of these halachos because if it's a pri, it's a pri. If it's not a pri, it's not a pri. So says the Gemara, as we saw yesterday, again, still in the quotations here, you shouldn't assume that it's like that presumption of that we're talking about a full fruit, that's what the pasuk is referring to. And because we know that the psukim are there to add more than what we would have thought, what was it that the Torah was doing by adding in another prat? This is the final prat, so it's prat, uklal, and then this last prat of nichartzan and vadzog. So we had said, lomar lachshu kol makom shatamotze prat uklal. Whenever you see a prat followed by a klal, I atar rishoy lemoshcha v'laduno kein haprat elana seklal mosif al haprat. So we have this very important distinction, though subtle, and that is as follows. We know there's something called a prat uklal uprat. There's also something called a prat uklal. The prat uklal is far more inclusive than a prat uklal uprat. If you have a prat uklal, so then what we do is we take the prat and we take the klal and we add them. So there's many, many, many cases of isser. However, in the case of prat uklal uprat, it's way more limited. So we're only missing one word, but in halachic terms, the difference between prat uklal on the one side and prat uklal uprat on the other, because we added that last prat, it's a way more limiting and non-inclusive version of understanding a pasuk. Ad says the last line of Lamed Daled Amud Beis, shiur lecha hakasub kederech sheparat lecha benazir mechartzanim v'adzag, and that's the difference between a pasuk that's only a prat uklal versus our pasuk by Nazir, which is prat uklal uprat, way, way, way more limiting. And this was the shita that we saw of the Rabbanan that did not seem to include the alim and the lulavim, the leaves and the shoots. So let's review our machlokes. According to Rabbi Eliezer, because the way he learned the pasuk was based on ribuyim and miutim, he therefore said that because that's a bit of a looser type of limud, so therefore a nazir would be chayav for eating not only the grapes, but also the leaves and the shoots, but not the bark, not the vine. Masha'en kain, according to this approach of pratu klalu prat, that's going to be even more limited in scope, as we pointed out. The pratu klalu prat is one of the most limiting of all of the Yud Gimel Midos Shator Nidreshes Bahem. So when you see that, you can expect a very small sample of Isser when you're done. Our small sample of Isser is the grape, according to the prat to klal prat. The olim and the lulavim, the leaves and the shoots, are not part of the isser. You can eat them if you're a Nazir. You just can't eat the grape itself. Now, we just pointed out at the end of this quote that the second prat was michartzanim va'ad zag. But if you'll recall, we learned in our Mishnah yesterday at the top of Lamed Daled Amud Beis the following line. The Gemara says on the very top line of Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah de kamokim l'hai michartzanim va'ad zag. Yesterday we saw in our Mishnah this unique shita of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah that he learned the pasuk of michartzanim va'ad zag to teach us the following: Lomar she'eino chayav ad sheyochal beis chartzanim v'zag, that you have to eat 2 chartzanim and 1 zag, based on the fact that the pasuk speaks in plural by chartzanim and speaks in singular in regards to zag. So if that's true, then we don't have our second prat anymore, because it's being used already. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the pasuk of michartzanim va'ad zag is not available for the prat. So we have a prat and a klal, everyone agrees. But the second prat, it seems to be that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah isn't allowed to use the pasuk of michartzanim va'ad zag for the second prat. Why not? It's being used already. So says the Gemara, a chiddush. The Gemara says, Savar Laib must be the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds like Rabbi Eliezer, the Darish Miyed V'Riba. It seems to be that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold like our approach of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan said that the psukim should be looked at through the lens of prat to klalu prat. That doesn't work for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because the final prat was from the pasuk of mechartzanim va'ad zag. But the pasuk mechartzanim va'ad zag was used already. You can't use it twice. We know this rule from drushes. You can't use it twice. So therefore, says the Gemara, it must be, we have no other option but to say that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is not learning prat to klalu prat, but rather he is learning ribuye umiute. So says the Gemara, that's one possible answer. V'i bais ema. Now the language turns back. A couple of days ago it was v'i bais tema, and here the language is v'i bais ema. A lot of inconsistencies in the text. But says the Gemara, you might think that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is trapped into holding like Rabbi Eliezer, that we're talking about a case of ribuye umiyute, that's the right way to look at the pasuk. But says the Gemara, we could even explain the shita of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah kirabanan. We're 6 lines down on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. Let's continue. The isal kedaitach kida'amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. If you really want to say that all that was meant to be learned from the words of mechartzanim va'ad zag was the drush of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah of 2 chartzanim and 1 zag, says the Gemara, no way. Then lichtavei rachmana lahai mechartzanim ve'ad zag gabe prate. Then we should be able to use it in regards to the prat as well. Lemai hilchas kasvei basar klal. Why was it written after this? Shma mina lemidaine bichlal uprat. So says the Gemara, the way that it was written mechartzanim ve'ad zag is an odd way to write it. We'll see why that's true in a minute. And therefore, we're able to learn it even as a prat. Says the Gemara, but if it's able to be learned as a prat, the ema kule lahachi hudasa, maybe the entire pasuk of mechartzanim va'ad zag is for the prat, and then we can't learn out mechartzanim va'ad zag that the only isser is when there's 2 chartzanim and 1 zag. So im kain, if that were to have been true, says the Gemara, lichtav oshne chartzanim oshne zagin, then the pasuk should have said 2 chartzanim and 2 zagin, o chartzan v'zag. They should have kept the, we do this in our writing all of the time. We say, when we're talking about one person, we'll say like, oh, they said. We'll correct that as English teachers and say that's not correct English. You got to get the plurals and the singulars right.
It is now.
It's been recorded. I'm going to say it outright. If you're one person, you're not a they. So the Gemara here says, sorry. What, in the bracha?
With one Kohen, do you say Kohanim when they duchen, or?
Oh, what does the Chazan say?
Don't say anything. They go straight to a bunch of starts the bracha.
Oh. In Eretz Yisrael, when I lived in Israel, by the way, the Chazan never was the one who said Kohanim. The Gabbai always would say Kohanim when I was in Eretz Yisrael. So when I moved back to America and I started davening here, I'm like, they're waiting for me to say it. I'm not even supposed to talk. I thought it was like us or to talk. I didn't know. It's a difference in Minhag Eretz Yisrael and Minhag America. Okay. Anyways, the Gemara says that we have room. Oh, you just missed all the fun. Says the Gemara. Says the Gemara that if it were to be that the pasuk of mechartzanim va'ad zag was meant to be used only as a prat, So why the strange language? Why did we have the missed matchup of singular to plural? Mechartzan and v'adzog. So says the Gemara, l'may hilchos hakasav rachman and mechartzan v'adzog. Shma mino the midrash bay klal uprat. V'kanami the midrash bay ad sheyochal shnei chartzan and v'adzog. Says the Gemara, because of the weird phraseology of mechartzan and v'adzog, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah can use it for two purposes. He can use it for klal uprat and for he can use it for prat uklal and the last prat. And he can also use it to say that the Isser occurs when you eat two chartzanim in one zug. Why? Because the language is weird. And we're picking up on the fact that the word chartzanim is plural when the word zug is singular. Okay. Now, yesterday, when we were at the simpler parts of this sugya, the Gemara said, and we're now halfway down on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, what did we say? Rabbi Elazar dedarish mi'et v'riba, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who looks at this pasuk from the lens of a miut and a ribui. Does he hold a prat uklal uprat minole? Where does he get the idea? It's still a thing, is that right? It's hard for us to know. I don't know the answer to this. When we look at a pasuk and we say ribui v'miut, versus when we look at a pasuk and when we say klale uprat. Very hard to know. I don't know the answer to that question, and we're not going to see it today. But it's hard to know that. But we do know that there is this thing of prat uklal uprat. So says the Gemara, where does Rabbi Eliezer see that as it's sourced? So says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Abo, Nafkale mehaikra. He learns it from the following pasuk. Now, whenever you learn psukim, and you're going to then parse them out by pratim and klalim, it's always healthy to see the whole pasuk first. So much easier to understand when we're done. So let's take a look at this pasuk in the margin here. If you have the pasuk, if not, I'll read it out loud for you. Pasuk in Shemos Kaf Beis. Ki yitain ishal re'ehu chamor oshor oseh v'chol behema lishmor. Someone gives you an animal to watch. You're now a shomer. Umeis o nishbar o nishba ein roeh, and it dies, or the item that you're watching breaks, or it's been captured and nobody saw. So this is the pasuk. How does this pasuk get parsed out? Says the Gemara, v'chiyitain ishal re'ehu chamor oshor oseh. We're drilling down to the types of animals. That's a prat. Good. Then it says v'chol behema. That's a klal. And then the pasuk circles back. Lishmor, you need to watch that animal. Chazar uprat. And what's that? Prat uklal uprat. Iyatadana lakena prat. So we have an answer. We have a pasuk which, according to Rabbi Eliezer, presented here by Rabbi Abo, but Rabbi Abo is answering for Rabbi Eliezer, that even though Rabbi Eliezer views the psukim that we started with by Nazir, he views those as ribuye umiute, but he does agree that there's a pasuk of prat uklal uprat, and it is this pasuk that we have here by Shomer.
It's a tzivur. It's not just one thing. Lishmor encompasses everything.
It's true, but when you're doing shmira, you're doing it on the one item, whatever the animal is. The Rishonim discussed this question, and we'll see it again in another frame, in another pasuk, very similar type of question that you're asking. But that is, Rabbi Resnick explained it that way also, is that you're watching one thing, you're watching your one item, and that's considered to be the prat. It's a great question, though. Now, Rava gives the second answer, a second possible source as to how we know that Rabbi Eliezer agrees to pratu klalu prat. Here's the next pasuk. Omar nafkale mehaikra. It's from the following pasuk. Let's read the pasuk inside. This is a pasuk Vayikra Yud, Vayikra Perek Aleph. It's important where this is located. Vayikra Perek Aleph, pasuk Yud. We'll come back to this in a moment. What does the pasuk say? V'minatzon korbano minak savim umin ha'izim leolah zachar tamim yakrivenu. Back in the Gemara, 8 lines up. V'im mean, if it is from, you didn't need the word mean. Should have said v'im tzon. What does it mean? Mean? That's prat. Hatzon, that is the flock, a broad language, therefore klal. And ksavim v'izim, those are specific small animals. Then chazaru prat, and therefore pratu klalu prat, yatadan l'kina prat. One way or the other, Rabbi Eliezer now has a source that indicates that he holds a pratu klalu prat. So says the Gemara, Rava's answer is very difficult. Says the Gemara, Omar le Rav Yehuda midiskarta le Rava. So they clearly were talking to one another. They lived at the same time. 4th century of the Amoraim. They lived about 100 or so years after Rebbe. This is in the early to mid 300s of the Common Era. And says the Gemara, that Rabbi Yehuda midiskarta did not like Rava's response. Why didn't you learn from another pasuk? V'leilaf min hadein kra. Why didn't you learn from the other pasuk? What other pasuk is he talking about? So Rava quoted a pasuk from Vayikra, Perek Aleph pasuk Yud, but he should have used the pasuk 8 psukim earlier, which is Vayikra Perek Aleph pasuk Beis. So he said, why did you ditch? You overlooked the pasuk 8 psukim ago. in Rava's head, he's coursing through Zilberman style the entire time. I got one. It's Vayikra Perak Aleph Pasuk Yud. He's like, Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta is like, why would you do that? You just skipped over a pasuk. That's a perfect example of prat to klal uprat. What's the pasuk? Let's read it in the side first. Daber al bnei Yisrael, beginning of Parshas and Sefer Vayikra. Va'amarta lehem Adam ki akri mikem korban Lashem min habema min habakar min hatzon takrivu es korbanchem. Back inside 4 lines from the bottom. Mean, that word, as we pointed out in the previous pasuk, is a prat. Ha behema, referring to animals in general, is a klal. Bakar vitzon chazaru prat. Pratu klalu prat, iyatadan elakena prat, and therefore this is our question mark against Rava. Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta is like, you just overlooked one. Why would you do that? Amar le, Rava responds to Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta, I have a very good reason as to why I didn't pick pasuk beis and why I picked pasuk yud. And here's the answer. Min hai leka lemishmamina. From pasuk beis, you're not able to learn out pratu klal uprat. Why? The ime hasam. If I would have used that pasuk as my source for pratu klalu prat, then hava mina, that when it says ha behema, the animal, it was a broader language of chaya bichlal behema, which is an odd thing to say, and Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta will knock this down in a moment. So therefore Rava couldn't even, his brain was like, no, that doesn't work, because like ha behema is too broad, it might include chaya, and that's not true. So therefore, it's not a good pratu klalu prat. So it says, Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta, back to Rava, top of Lamed Hey Amud Beis. We're going to go to the 2 dots, 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar le chaya bichlal behema. Look, we are budding Talmidei Chachamim. Let's give ourselves a nod. None of us would say that a chaya is a behema. Why is Rava saying that a chaya is a behema? And what? Rava said he couldn't use that pasuk because habehema implied that way. So Amar le chaya bichlal behema. Rava, what are you talking about? How could a chaya be bichlal behema? Haksiv, the pasuk says 2 words later. Haksiv bakar vitzon. The havale pratu klal uprat. That's the aleph here. That we have an extra word here. V'yatadana lakena prat, and he completely rejects Rava. Rava says the pratu klal uprat doesn't work because the word habehema is too broad. And Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta is like, it's called contextual learning. It says bakar and son in the same pasuk. So what are you talking about? So Rava wasn't comfortable with using pasuk beis. Rabbi Yehuda Midiskarta was. Fine. Either way, we answered our question. We were troubled. Where does Rabbi Eliezer hold? If we know that Rabbi Eliezer looks at the psukim by Nazirus as ribuye umiute, where do we see Rabbi Eliezer using psukim, learning them through the lens of pratu klalu prat? And we've given 3 examples. 3 of which are acceptable to most, and only 2 of which are acceptable to Rava. Rava couldn't handle pasuk beis. Says the Gemara, uminayin dahachihu, which is not helpful because I don't know what you're talking about. So says the Balei Tosfos, just look to the right. Second Tosfos, Dibur Maslim Linayin dahachi, arabanan kai. The darshe le'el klalu pratu klal. This is the wrong language. It actually should be pratu klalu prat. That's a correction. So according to the Shita of the Rabbanan, who are Doresh, Pratu Klalu Prat, Umar Be'ke'ein HaPrat, and you limit the drasha by that last Prat, how do you know that this works? Says the Gemara, let's take a look. Titania. We have a pasuk in regards to Meiser. Let's read the pasuk in full. The pasuk says, V'nosata hakesef v'chol asher te'aven nafshecha, ba'bakar u'vatzon u'vayayin u'vashechar, v'chol asher tish'alcha nafshecha, v'echalta sham lifnei Hashem elokecha v'samachta tovesecha. You're allowed to transfer the sanctity of your Meiser onto a coin. This is for Meiser Sheni. Bring it to Yerushalayim, carry the coins, buy acceptable foods that you're allowed to buy in Yerushalayim, and then eat them. But what are the acceptable foods? In order to know which foods are acceptable, we need to know what this drasha is. This is like the biggest musar behind these kinds of gemaras that are very hard and technical, is that this is the only way to extract Ratzon Hashem from Sukkim. I know it's hard. I find them, please excuse me, difficult to learn, difficult to teach, and less enjoyable than other gemaras. This is the only way that the Chachamim were able to draw out what we need from the Psukim. So it is, I know it's hard, but we like that's our desire to hang on here, because even though it's somewhat hard, this is really the only way to understand this pasuk. So it says the Brisa as follows: the Tanya, V'nasata hakesef b'chol asher taven nafshecha klal, ba'bakar uvatzon uvayayin uvashechar prat, uv'chol asher tishalcha nafshecha chazaru klal, klalu pratu klal, iatadan ela ke'ena prat. Now, a klal uprat uklal is not the same as a prat uklal uprat. And we're going to see what those differences are in the Gemara. Very subtle, very small differences. And by the way, this is probably why the Balei HaTosfos had their language as klal uprat uklal, because the example that the Gemara gives really isn't answering up the way the Rabbanan was supposed to be answered, because the Rabbanan were talking about a prat uklal uprat. So it's probably, I'm just guessing, it's probably the case that when the Balei HaTosfos said klal uprat uklal, they were quoting from the Gemara right in front of them. Okay, now, based on this, what is it that we learn from this klal uprat uklal? So what we've extracted from the klal uprat uklal is as follows, 8 lines down. Mahaprat mefurash primi pri v'gidulei karka. That which is referenced in the pasuk is the fruit of a fruit, and it says grows from the ground. It means nourished from the ground. To exclude, for example, a fish, which is not nourished from the ground. Animals are nourished from the ground; they graze. Fish are not. So therefore, here's what we would then include in regards to what's capable of being part of Meiser Sheni, af kol primi pri v'gidulei karka. Take a look at Rashi, the Rivan, 7 lines down on the page, Dibur Maskal Detanya. The Gemara says that based on this drush of Israbu Lahu Ophos, we can include into the list of Meiser Sheni things that are primi pri, they grow from one generation to the next, and they're also Gidulei Karka, and says the Rashi, says the Rivan, V'im itu lahu dagim. But fish, you can't take Meiser Sheni money and go to the fish market. You're not allowed to do that. She'ein gedelin al hakarka. We saw this 2 years ago. This is not something that actually is nourished from the ground. So based on the commonalities of the klal uprat uklal, what we extract from there is only certain things can be purchased with Meiser Sheni money. It has to be primi pri. They have to grow from one generation to the next, which is true of vegetation. It's true of animals, just not true of fish, true of chickens. And it also has to be nourished from the ground. Okay. So then we answered that question. We said, how do we extract things? This is our marimakom, our primary marimakom. Michti says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Klal uprat uklal kein prota dainina. When we have a case like we just had by Meiser Sheni, where we have the klal first, prat second, klal last, we follow the prat. Klala basra my ahani. What does the last klal do? If we had klal uprat, wouldn't we also follow the prat? What does the last klal do for us? Klala basra my ahani. Says the Gemara, ahani leosufe kol damile. Says the Gemara, that's what we just saw, is that it adds in things that are similar. This last klal added to the list of acceptable Meiser Sheni food, chickens. It added to the list of acceptable Meiser Sheni food anything that was mefurash primi pri and gidulei karka. Without that, we would have had an incorrect understanding of the pasuk. Visu, and furthermore, says the Gemara, 1/3 of the way down, pratu klalu prat kein prat daininan. We have a similar structure, but inverted. In the case that we were dealing with the Rabbanan of pratu klalu prat, where we do follow the prat as well, prata basra mai ahani. What does the last prat add to the mix? Says the Gemara, ilav prata basra. If I didn't have the last detail that was mentioned in the pasuk, let's use our Nazir example of mechartanim v'adzag. Havamina, I might have thought nase klal mosif ala prat. If I only had prat uklal, I would have assumed that those two things add to one another, prat and klal, not just prat or klal. But now that I've added another prat, I know it's extremely limited. So the difference between a prat uklal and a prat uklal uprat is night and day. Had we said Nazirus was about prat uklal, the whole vine would have been forbidden for Nazirus. But because it's a prat uklal, uprat, so therefore we say, no, not everything is going to be usher, only the grape, according to the Rabbanan, within this example. Umichti, says the Gemara, and now it starts speaking in code, like we're comfortable with this stuff. Says the Gemara, train klali uprata. When you have 2 klalim and a prat, aka klalu pratu klal, right, you're starting to get too comfortable. Just keep the wordy part because it was easier. And if you also have utrain prate uklala, and if you have a prat uklalu prat, 2 prats and a klal, kein prata daininan, they're both very similar. Mai ika beini uveni. So says the Gemara, what is the difference between a klalu prat uklal, where we follow the prat, and a prat uklal uprat, where we follow the prat? Why did you create 2 constructs of Kadosh Baruch Hu for us to learn from, when they both function the same way? And this is an important question because we're used to seeing some of these in Rabbi Shmuel. We learn klalu pradu klal danak elakena prat. We don't learn the other one, which is important because if we don't learn it, that if we only look at the Torah through the lens of Rabbi Shmuel, then certain halachos wouldn't apply. So says the Gemara, here's the difference between klalu pradu klal on the one hand and pradu klalu prat on the other. Ika de ilutartein klale uprata, when we're dealing with a klalu pradu klal, ika prata de damila afilu bechadzad marbinan. Even if there's only one commonality between that which I'd like to include and that which is the pasuk included, even if there's only one commonality, the klal uprat uklal would include it. But in regards to trei prate uklale, klala, when I'm dealing with a prat uklal uprat, there, ika prata dedami mishnei tzadin marbinan. Only if there's a double feature of comparison will I include them. But bechad tzad lo marbinan. But if there's only one feature of similarity between what the pasuk included and what the prat would like to add, no dice. Therefore, klalu pradu klal is the most limiting factor. It not only focuses on the prat, but even if a sample that's similar to the prat has one common feature to it, it's included in the Yisr. Very strict. But the prat uklalu prat doesn't include everything under the sun. Most things, yes. But in order to include a sample, it has to have two features that are common and not one. So let's say, for example, that we saw above in the case of the klalu pradu klal of the Meiser Sheni, we had said that there were two features. One feature was that it was pre, and one feature was that it was gidule karka. According to the version of klalu pradu klal, even if only one of those two features applied, we would include it in the list. But had the drasha been pradu klalu prat, we would not have included that feature with only one similarity. We would have needed two. So the strictest level of learning, the tightest, the most inclusive version of Isser is klalu pradu klal. The one under that is prat uklal uprat. Says the Gemara 10 lines or so from the bottom. Michti, prat uklal, when the prat comes first and there's a klal, nase klal, mosif ala prat, visrabi kol mili. This we saw, that when you have only prat uklal, we add in so much. It's everything. Umiet v'riba nami riba hakol visrabi kol mili. So now the Gemara wants to know, ma'ika bein miet v'riba leprat uklal. At the end of the day, they're very similar. If you have a ribui and a miut, it's no difference to a prat and a klal. Says the Gemara, an answer that requires the Rishonim to contort themselves to figure out what's going on, because this completely upends what we learned yesterday. Ika, it is the case that ilu pratu klal marbina nafilu alan vilulavin. When it comes to the case of pratu klal would have included into the Isser of Nazirus alan and lulavin, the leaves and the shoots. Umied v'riba, but in the case of mied v'riba, lulavin in alan lo. This is not what we learned yesterday. Because yesterday we said, why does Rabbi Eliezer in the Brisa include leaves and shoots? Because he says ribui umiut. What does this Gemara say? Ribui and miut only includes the lulavin, but not the leaves. So the Balei Tosfos pick up on this. Don't worry, I know it's a massive Tosfos, but we're only learning the first line. Tosfos, 3/4 of the way down, and the Balei Tosfos there say, Tema, that doesn't make sense. Rabbi Eliezer darish miid v'riba b'tchila shmaitza umar be'afilu olim. That's not how we started the sugya. We started this whole sugya with a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Eliezer says that the shoots and the leaves are included in the Yisr. Why? Ribui v'miut. Our sugya ends, no, ribui v'miut is only the lulavin and not the leaves. Stira. And the Balei Tosfos call it out. So now we're going to split yet another hair, which is that there are multiple kinds of leaves, which is the only way to get around it. The Yesh Lomar, say the Balei Tosfos, right under the Dibur HaMaschil, middle of the line. Dileel, earlier when the Gemara presented the Ribui Miut of Rabbi Eliezer, where he included the leaves, that was Ma'iri Ba'alin Rachin. Dumya dilulavin. Those are the soft leaves that are very similar to the shoots. V'hacha, when our Gemara says that the ribui and the miut leaves out the leaves, that they are not included in the Yisr of Nazirus, that's Ma'iri de Kashek Tzas, the Damuk Tzas L'Shabishta. They're more similar in their nature to the actual vine itself, which is more wood-like. So now, if this were to be the case, had we paskened this way, that means that if you're a Nazir, that you're not allowed to eat certain leaves and you are allowed to eat other leaves, and you'd have to know the difference between them. We'll stop right here and pick up tomorrow, Mir Hashem, at the bottom of Lamed Hey Amud Beis at the 2 dots. Wishing you all a beautiful night.